The NFL placed Josh Brown on the commissioner's exempt list Friday for violating the league of the New York Giants. Mr. Mara or any of those who have supported me along the way. I have taken measures to get help so that I may be a voice of change, not a statistic. It is important to share that I never struck my wife and never would. Abuse takes many forms, and it is not a gray area. Through the past several years, I've worked to identify and rectify my own behaviors. The road to rehabilitation is a journey and a constant modification of a way of life. My journey will continue forever as a person determined to leave a positive legacy, and I embrace the opportunity to show and speak about what has helped me to be that man. In the interim, I'm cooperating with the Giants and the NFL. Thank you to everyone that has supported me. I will not let you down. So after Josh released that statement, Giants owner John Mara releasing a statement of his own where he decided to not keep Josh on the commissioner's exempt list, but to release him. We believed we did everything at every juncture in our relationship with Josh. Our beliefs, our judgments were misguided. We accept that responsibility. Will Kane now with us. How we doing, Will?
Good. Good morning to you.
Good morning. I want to start with you here. What can the NFL learn from this?
Well, I think that the NFL has a choice to make. The NFL, the New York Giants, individual teams can either choose to stand by their convictions, develop principles, and do what is right for both victims and the accused, or it can cave to the grandstanding of the media and the mindlessness of the mob. I believe that the New York Giants originally tried to do what they thought was right. Now, ultimately, they gave in to publicity and PR, as we've seen the NFL over and over do. It's a business, it's driven by the audience, aka the consumers, and often the media. So ultimately, it will bend to the will of the popular public. But that doesn't mean it was right, ultimately, in what they did yesterday. Now, listen, I need to say these caveats every time, but I don't believe it is ever right to place your hands on a woman. I grew up in a culture and in a place where the definition of what a man is certainly undercut by anyone who would touch a woman in any sort of violent way. But that being said, I don't think this is that simple, Molly, Stephen A., and Max. I don't think it's as simple as those that are for domestic violence and those that are not. I think the Giants and John Mara attempted to indulge some very difficult questions that all of us should. Questions like, what is the standard of guilt when we decide somebody has or has not committed domestic violence? When should we give allowances for when someone is actually actively seeking help, which it appeared that Josh Brown was? When should we afford second chances? That's a deep moral question. I think the Giants, and I can't say this for certainty, but I think the Giants were attempting to indulge a lot of these questions, but ultimately that's not allowed anymore. What is only allowed now, and this is largely driven by the media, and this is where I get the most upset because it's a complete dereliction of our jobs, but you're either on the side of domestic violence or you're not. That's what we've reduced this to. We have said, if you don't get on television and attempt to prove, more than the next guy who's going to speak after you, that you are so opposed to domestic violence, that that it is the most egregious sin, and no way can you be more opposed to it than me. If we don't do that, then we risk being someone who is in support of it. And ultimately what we have done is we go on TV and we either try to brand ourselves as virtuous. By the way, I don't think you're virtuous for things you say on television. Or you're just afraid to bring up important questions because of the risk of being labeled as somebody who's callous. And that has real cost. And this is the most important thing. When you reduce it to this, you hurt, number one, the victim. Molly Brown asked repeatedly that Josh Brown not be fired. She needed his income. Read an article by Diana Moskovitz on Deadspin.com from yesterday. The person that is often hurt when an accused is cut from his job is the victim. They need the family support and income. You also hurt anyone that's potentially seeking help. The smoking gun in this case was Josh Brown's journal entries and therapy records. He was seeking help. What about the next guy? Will the next guy go seek help if he believes it will ultimately end in his conviction? And third, you're going to hurt the next victim, because they're going to be much more reluctant to report. They don't want their husbands to lose their job or their ex-husbands to lose their jobs, so they lose support. They're worried, and we saw this, by the way, with Aroldis Chapman's ex-wife. She was afraid on the call with 911. She was afraid he would be arrested because she knew that would hurt her family eventually. The point is, you're reducing this. We have reduced it to simplistic, stupid questions, and we have hurt everybody in the process. So will the NFL learn anything? I don't think so. It's us in the media that need to learn something.
I want to address a couple of things you brought up. First of all, the Moskowitz article. I touched on this the other day when the subject came up about the family as an economic unit. One of the issues that I thought she went over very well in her article is that if the punishment, once a domestic violence perpetrator is found, let's assume guilt for a second, if the punishment is you lose your job, that can dissuade the victims of the violence who are reliant, in this case, even a divorced couple who gets alimony or child support, that can dissuade, that can work as an incentive to not report domestic violence, which is what we don't want, particularly when someone like Josh Brown's journal, for example, points out, is actually taking a look at themselves and trying to accept responsibility and change. Of course, there's recidivist behavior, and maybe in his case, that doesn't apply as much based on the way he actually behaved, apparently. But the question is, what can the NFL learn from the Josh Brown situation? And I think one of the reasons, Will, that you get some grandstanding about it is because there are two things the NFL can learn. One, do a serious investigation. Really investigate. When you call up and say, hey, can we see the journal? And the police department says no, and you don't identify yourself as calling from the NFL and you don't follow up, that's one. You can
say, in response to that one, Max, the NFL is not built to be an investigative body.
Sure.
It's Keystone Cops when it's investigating. It simply will never satisfy anybody's standards of what a thorough or appropriate investigation is.
But if it was any kind of competent person, they wouldn't just say, no, okay, thanks, click. You do. I mean, it didn't seem that hard to get. Now, maybe it's he said in this case, or they said, the sheriff's department and the NFL.
And they hired a staff for women to deal with these specific issues.
I just
thus illustrating how complicated
wait. So one, you have to investigate for real. Two, especially if you profess that we're really going to investigate and take it seriously. Two, you have to enforce your own rules. If the rule is a 6-game suspension, and you don't really investigate, and then you give a 1-game suspension, then it blows up into an issue where one after another wants to show how I'm more outraged than you. Then I agree there can be a cascading effect that may not be helpful in the genuine discourse in terms of how to make things better. But I think if you enforce, you investigate, 6 games, then it doesn't feel like a cover-up. It feels, at least, gives the impression that they're taking it seriously. And I don't think you get the same kind of pernicious kind of atmosphere afterwards that you get now.
They also re-signed him, too. Stephen A.
I think we're somewhat missing the point here. And I appreciate deeply what Will said, and I'll get into that in just a minute, Will. But hear me on this. The issue at hand is the hypocrisy on the part of the NFL and that of specifically the New York Giants. Because if indeed this was a domestic violence issue, and that is certainly the interpretation that was handed to us, then we have to go to John Mara, and we have to remember that this is the same individual as portrayed in an article, a column by Gary Myers of the New York Daily News in this past Sunday's paper, which was an exceptional column. And he highlighted the hypocrisy on the part of Mr. Mara because he was talking about how the Ray Rice situation went down. And one of the people very, very upset with how things were handled was Mara at Roger Goodell, because he thought a heavier hand should have been brought down upon Ray Rice from the initial circumstance of the situation when he initially got 2 games and before the video had come out. And John Mara was talking about how a mistake was made and we have to learn from this and we have to make sure we handle this in the dogged fashion that it requires. Well, that appeared to be, those words were inconsistent with his actions involving Josh Brown. The question is why? Why was it inconsistent, John Mara? Why was it inconsistent, New York Giants? Why was it inconsistent, NFL? Because Roger Goodell, through Lisa Friel and an assemblage of women that he had hired to investigate these matters and address them adroitly, what happened? You basically didn't do anything but hand down a 1 game. The fact that you put him on the exempt list just shows that it's something that you could have done earlier, but you elected not to do so when all of this pomp and circumstances about having a new committee with these women who were supposed to help you make these decisions were put in place, and then it wasn't exercised. So we have a negligence of duty on the part of the NFL, and certainly on the Giants organization, courtesy of Mr. Mara. Now let's go to what Will Kane just said. Will makes a very interesting point when he brings up how we, as the fourth estate, the media, simply hears the word domestic violence and that's that without investigating. He's absolutely right. And I actually don't give a damn about that if you put your hands on a woman. Because if you put your hands on a woman, the hell with all of this. You need to pay the price immediately. What gives me cause to pause is that when Josh Brown accepted being on the exempt list and he didn't appeal anything, hasn't fought it, and took the liberty to explain himself, what he specifically said is, I've never struck my wife. So if we're talking, let's just say for the sake of argument that he didn't hit her, he didn't grab her, he didn't shove her, he didn't push her. Now we're talking verbal. Now when it comes to verbal and there's no physical altercation, that needs to be investigated.
Right.
Because two people arguing with one another, I'm not saying in any way that this is the case because I don't know. What I'm saying is, if we were to find out that Josh Brown's definition of abuse was that he cussed at her because she cussed at him and they were cussing at each other, I would be embarrassed that we as a fourth estate would feel the need to get involved with something like that.
Well,
because it's like, oh, you're cussing at each other, and that's why we've been talking about this. Now, if there's any kind of physical violence whatsoever, to me, that's non-negotiable. But in terms of just verbal communication with one another, I don't know if that's any of our business to be passing judgment against somebody without a thorough investigation as to what all the facts may be. You don't require that necessarily when it comes to fisticuffs because you ain't got no business putting your hands on a woman. But if it's just verbal, I don't know if that's any of our business.
I'm not going to interrupt the conversation. I just want to add one thing. Josh Brown had been physically violent with her more than 20 occasions over the past several years, according to his wife. So I want to make that clear. So physical 20 times.
And in his journal.
So he's lying then. So he's lying then.
No.
Then he's lying.
I'm just saying,
to me, this is an illustration of why this deserves an elevated and complicated conversation. Josh Brown, in his journals, admitted to physically abusing Molly Brown. He also says he never struck her. So there's some gaps there, but they don't necessarily contradict each other. It adds Molly complicated questions, which I think is this. First, regarding the hypocrisy question that Stephen A. brings up. It's easy to be holier than thou when you are on the outside looking in, when you don't have to deal with these complicated questions about what exactly did Josh do? How is he trying to repent? Is he trying to get help? John Mara was on the outside in the Ray Rice case. He's on the inside this time. And so he's dealing with the dirty details of life now. So that's why he appears hypocritical. Because when he was on the outside, he's just like us. He can pass simplistic judgments.
But Will, what I'm saying to you is you can't let him off the hook because he's the one that felt the need to speak up about something when he knew he was on the outside.
It's possible.
So you don't get to acquire cover for yourself because now you're on the inside because you didn't give those on the inside cover when it came to something that you were not involved in, meaning Mr. Mara.
Right.
You didn't give them any cover. Well, so why should you get it now that you're the one on the inside?
The only answer to that, Stephen A., is that we have to be in pursuit of right, not getting even. We have to be in pursuit of finding ourselves on the side of righteousness. And by the way, if I'm being too naive, if I'm giving John Mara too much credit and assuming good intentions, I would ask you, be cynical. Just be cynical.
Let me ask you this.
Hold on, just to finish this point. Do you really think that the New York Giants thought his 37-year-old kicker was so important to their team that they should risk looking lenient on domestic violence? Or do you think that in a post-Ray Rice world, they wanted to appear like, oh, domestic violence, it's no big deal? I don't think they really thought that way. And by the way, listen to Josh Brown's teammates. Do you think Victor Cruz wants to look like a guy who doesn't care about domestic violence? Be cynical throughout the process, and you'll find yourself back at the place where you have to say, there's some complicated details here that have made it not into the public discussion.
With all due respect, you sound a little bit like a cross between Dr. Phil and Oprah here. And what I mean by that is this. You're basically saying if you're looking at Mr. Mara, okay, excuse me, he wasn't looking at it this way, he wasn't looking at it that way. Well, we don't know what the hell he was looking at. All we could go by are his actions. I understand, because as I understood it, Josh Brown said he didn't strike his wife, but he admitted to physical altercations, and which y'all just confirmed, reiterated to me, because we had discussed this the other day. But based on what his letter from the other day, he tried to come across as if he's never really physically harmed her. He was trying to give that impression. That's the way I took it.
I want to take it back to Diana Moskowitz's excellent article in Deadspin about this. What makes one of the things, and we were talking about this, I guess late last week, I suppose. One of the things that makes domestic violence different and worse than other forms of violence is the family as the economic unit. Even if the family's separated, especially in the NFL, high-paying jobs, we're talking about the likely breadwinner in the family, the majority of the family's income. And so, once again, in terms of the moralizing that everyone correctly does, because you want a public sanction against this kind of behavior, but you don't want that to be a wave that washes over every detail in such a way that in every single instance it results in the loss of your job, because that job is what Molly Brown is dependent upon right now, and one of the reasons she was hesitant to report.
I get that, but at the end of the day, no disrespect to anybody, but the bigger issue, and I agree with organizations like the National Organization for Women and others when it comes to this, at the end of the day, you can't sit up here and say, well, you know what? If there's physical violence being exacted against a woman, we have to take her feelings into consideration in terms of wanting to save her husband, you know, for his job, because it affects her negatively. If folks had that kind of attitude, then domestic violence would never be resolved.
Well, no, it wouldn't be resolved if it's not reported. Women can't be incentivized to not report. They should report so it can be dealt with.
So then we have to have some system where the wife or the family can still be supported, even if the player not necessarily isn't there. Because then if
absolutely,
because then if you're punishing basically essentially what you're saying, which is a great point, if you punish
Diana Moskowitz is really
Diana Moskowitz, but if you punish the perpetrator, then it's punishing the victim. So we have to figure that out. So it's not hurting the victim. But I just want to add one more thing before you give the solution. As far as whether he struck her or not, you can still be very physically violent. I don't want to get caught up on that word. There's many other things that you can do, and it's all egregious. So I don't want to start leveling like what's okay, what's not okay based on punishment.
Well, none of us are. Hold it. None of us are. None of us are trying to absolve him in any way if there were physical violence. My point is the verbal part. If there's no physical violence and all it is verbal, that's a bit more trickier. To me, it's not tricky at all if it's physical, because there should never be any kind of physical violence.
By the way, even if it's non-physical in a strict sense, if there was a history of physical violence and it's a big, strong football player behaving in an intimidating way, that also can be received as the police said when they saw Molly Brown. They said her behavior was consistent with someone who has suffered domestic abuse.
I think my overriding point, Max, is this, and it tells what you just said. We have to ask more questions and honestly have fewer conclusions, because not everybody, Molly, has the same definition of what they mean when they say, I was physically abusive. I don't know totally.
That's not realistic, Will.
I don't know what Josh Brown completely meant, and you don't either, because the other day when he said he didn't strike her, everybody's like, oh my gosh, I assumed he admitted to that earlier. We don't know.
What I'm saying,
and Max, if you broaden the category to non-physical, we don't know what that means either. I'm sorry, Stephen A.
I'm saying that from a conclusion perspective, one has to be drawn, because what the NFL is saying is that it's affecting our bottom line. Yeah. When the impression was we were not dealing with this, it was compromising their bottom line, which forced them to deal with it. So not having any conclusions is not, or having less conclusions, as you would say, is not going to work. You have to draw more conclusions because the public is demanding it, and a vast majority of that public are women. This is what they care about, and they're right to feel that way, and you have no choice but to address that. You can't wiggle around.
I just want to say the media and the NFL have a choice to make. You either are going to do something to really combat domestic violence and you really care about it, or you just want to look like you do.
I can just speak for the three of us on the show, and it's not that we want to look like we do. We want to see things get resolved and victims be properly taken care of, not just sensationalized for ratings. It's something close to all of our
How
hearts.
about, Molly?
Yeah.
Remember the solution I said? How about making sure instead of taking the money away from the players, whatever the money is that they're guaranteed, you give it to the wife, you give it to the family.
I'm with
they
it.
don't get it.
I'm with
Let
it.
let the wife get it.
We'll leave it there. Will,
Give it
thank
to
you, and
her.
appreciate your perspective on all of this. The NFL placed Josh Brown on the commissioner's exempt list Friday for violating the league of the New York Giants. Mr. Mara or any of those who have supported me along the way. I have taken measures to get help so that I may be a voice of change, not a statistic. It is important to share that I never struck my wife and never would. Abuse takes many forms, and it is not a gray area. Through the past several years, I've worked to identify and rectify my own behaviors. The road to rehabilitation is a journey and a constant modification of a way of life. My journey will continue forever as a person determined to leave a positive legacy, and I embrace the opportunity to show and speak about what has helped me to be that man. In the interim, I'm cooperating with the Giants and the NFL. Thank you to everyone that has supported me. I will not let you down. So after Josh released that statement, Giants owner John Mara releasing a statement of his own where he decided to not keep Josh